There's no doubt about it that oil and gas has seen many changes, even just from the late 1970s to today. And yet sometimes it's almost like we're repeating history when we should learn from history. I'll talk with a very, very well knowledge oil and gas expert in this on this episode of The Crude Truth.
In 1901, at Spindletop Hill near Beaumont, the future of Texas changed dramatically as, like a fountain of fortune, thousands of barrels of oil burst from the earth towards the sky. Soon, Detroit would be cranking out Model Ts by the millions, and America was on the move, thanks to the black gold being produced in Texas. Now, more than a century later, the vehicles are different, but nothing else has truly changed. Sure, there may be many other alternative energy sources like wind and solar and electric. But let's be honest, America depends on oil and entrepreneurs. And if the USA is truly going to be independent, it has to know the crude truth.
Well, I am so excited. Thank you so much for tuning in, for downloading, for watching this episode of The Crude Truth. My guest today is a man that basically knows the Fort Worth area almost like the back of his hand, born and raised, but also he has been fighting the good fight for the oil and gas industry since the late 1970s. My guest today is retired Congressman Martin Frost. Martin, how are you?
Doing fine, doing fine.
Good, good. You have been back on the circuit these last few weeks, talking to people again, letting people know. Do you feel like it's deja vu all over again?
Well, I did a lot of interviews when I was in Congress, but I've been out of Congress for about 20 years. I served from 1979 to 2005. However, I've done a lot of things since then in the public arena. But it was interesting. I grew up in Fort Worth, as you mentioned, and my dad worked at General Dynamics. He was an aerospace engineer. And I went to Pasco High School in Fort Worth. When I was first elected, I had Mansfield and some other areas in Tarrant County. And then my district, I moved over to Dallas, and then it moved back toward Fort Worth. You know, the legislature and the courts move these districts around all the time.
Man, well, you mentioned Fort Worth. I think I told you in the pre-meeting that, if you ask me where I'm from, hey, I'm born and raised in Fort Worth, Texas. But if you ask my wife, who grew up there in West Fort Worth at Ridgely, went to Southwest Christian High School, and then went to TCU. I was born and raised in Fort Worth, but I'm actually from North Richland Hill. She would say I am not from Fort Worth. And
I loved it. I loved Fort Worth, living there and growing up there, and I'm very proud of it. I grew up about 5 blocks from the TCU campus, and I'll tell you a little story. When I was growing up in Fort Worth, if you were under the age of 18, you could go to TCU home football games for 50 cents and sit in the end zone. So from the time I was 10 years old until I went away to college, I saw every TCU home game.
Wow, I can't imagine. I've got a 1-year-old, and we took him to his first game this year, and we definitely did not have infield on the field passes. We barely got to the edge of the gate, took a picture, and that's as far as they let us go. So I can't imagine being able to sit on the field during a football game. That sounds like some good times, right?
It was fun, and my grandparents, who were from San Antonio, they weren't from Fort Worth, were original investors in the Cotton Bowl when it was built in the 1930s. They were bondholders, and so they had an option on tickets. And so I got to go to Cotton Bowl games with my grandmother, saw TCU play at the end of the 55 season, at the end of the 56 season, and the Cotton Bowl. That was fun.
Oh my gosh, that is, shoot, how old are you? I mean,
I've got a few years on you.
I would say so. I don't mean to be rude or anything. But
right.
Holy cow, to watch TCU in the Cotton Bowl.
I was a kid then, but it was fun to go.
Of course. And you mentioned, that's where my parents are from, is from San Antonio. They moved here to Fort Worth. Well, actually, they moved to Dallas first in the late 1970s. And then they moved to North Richland Hills in 1982. And,
well, my dad was from San Antonio and went to Alamo Heights High School there.
Okay.
And grandfather was in the clothing business. He had a store called Frost Brothers, which was a very nice store. It's not in business anymore. And my mother was from East Texas, from Henderson. And I remember going out to Henderson and seeing all these pumping wells, everywhere you went. They were on the schoolyard, they were in the courthouse. It was interesting introduction to the oil and gas business as a kid.
You talk about Henderson. I had on a gentleman named Brad Little on my show called the CRUDE Truth, on the CRUDE Truth, excuse me. And his father was a coach in East Texas, and he has a book that talks about his time growing up with his father. And he mentions, I think, that there's a well on the football field there in Henderson. Yeah, and it's literally I think in the back of the end zone pumping.
Yeah, my grandfather on my mother's side was mayor of Henderson in the 30s for 2 terms.
Holy
and
cow!
My great uncle was a state senator from that part of the state from 1903 to 1911. So the family on one side was in politics.
And then you just kept that tradition going, huh?
That's right. But I don't think anybody else is going to run for office in my family. I'd be surprised.
Well, you mentioned your father had a clothing store. Was that also in Alamo Heights?
My grandfather, yeah.
Your grandfather was, and that was in Alamo Heights?
Yeah, well, that was in downtown. He lived in that. They lived in Alamo Heights, but his store was downtown on Houston Street. It was a clothing store called Frost Brothers.
That is
very well-known store at the time. It's out of business now.
Well, you know what? It is a small world. My grandfather owned several Gulf stations, and one of them was on Commerce Street.
Oh, I know where Commerce Street is.
Yes, and he used to have the old attorney, is it J.A. Saman? Something like that. He used to hang out with that gentleman a lot. I think he was one of the prominent lawyers probably around the same time.
Well, my great uncle from Henderson was the leading lawyer in Rusk County. And after he was in the legislature, he was in law practice. And so he was on retainer to all the major law firms that had business in Rusk County. And while he was not in the business, he took some royalty interest as fees. And so those kind of got passed down, and I get smaller royalty checks these days. It's passed down through several generations, and I don't throw them away. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, I wouldn't throw them away either, and I don't think anybody throws them away anymore. This day and age, people may sell the surface rights to a developer, but everybody's holding on, which rightfully so. Yeah. I know as an operator and an E&P company here at Pecos Country Operating. We would love to get our hands on some real minerals and be like some of the older families that drill and on their own land, and man, they've got 100%, and there ain't nothing wrong with that.
Well, my great grandfather died in 1941, and he was a small town merchant and was later an investor, and so he had some royalty interests that kind of passed down, but those passed through so many members of the family. It's a very small percentage again. Yeah. So some of these royalty interests that I have date back many, many years.
No, you mentioned a very small royalty interest. My father started out the career in the oil and gas industry by writing software, accounting software, and so some of these places that some of these individuals have. Leases were like up in maybe some Indian territory, and each family got a piece of that, so they might be cutting 100 checks. They might only do it twice a year, but yeah, they'd be cutting 100 checks every time. So my father, that's how he got his understanding in the oil and gas industry, was basically by understanding the accounting of it, going, this is a pretty good deal.
Yeah, when I was elected to Congress, of course, there were every Texas congressman is concerned about issues that affect our state. There may be some other things you worry about, but I certainly was concerned about national defense, because we had a lot of defense contractors in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And I was concerned about the oil industry because it was so important to the economy of our state. So you can't serve in office as a politician or office holder from Texas and not be concerned about the oil and gas industry. And that's true of both Democrats and Republicans.
Yes, you mentioned you mentioned General Dynamics, and obviously that is a way that we do stay secure in America. But also, like you mentioned, oil and gas helps us stay strong and secure at the same time.
No question about that. No question about that. And the way I got in, if I can tell you a little bit about the background. The way I got involved in the oil and gas industry was that I had a lot of friends who were who were in the business and had supported me when I was a congressman. And when I left Congress, they they set up several organizations to promote oil and gas interests in the Southwest. And one of those is the Council for a Secure America. A very leading oil man from Oklahoma, Harold Hamm, was the primary mover in that, as well as a lot of other people. And I had known them over the years, and they wanted. I was no longer a congressman, but I stayed in Washington, and so they wanted somebody to represent them. So I did some lobbying for people in the oil and gas industry a number of years before I retired. And one of the major things I was involved in some years ago, Congress repealed a 40-year limit or restriction against exporting of crude oil that was passed during the 1970s. And people in the industry wanted to get that repealed, but they couldn't get it off the books. So they retained me, and they also retained J.C. Watts, a Republican former congressman from Oklahoma. And on a bipartisan basis, we got that repealed. That was a very interesting fight. And it worked out. And I think it's benefited some people in the industry in our state because people do want to export crude oil in addition to using it here in our country.
You know, you mentioned that 40-year ban. Do you recall exactly, was that during the Carter administration or during the Nixon / Ford administration?
Well, this was passed during the Nixon administration, this particular ban. But the first 2 years I was in Congress was during the last 2 years of the Carter presidency. And then I served, I served with 5 presidents. And it was interesting. It was Carter and then Reagan and Bush and Clinton and Bush. And I served with 5 speakers. So those jobs, they don't last too long. You can work in this business for a while, but it's hard to have a long career. So I had the opportunity to work with 5 speakers and five presidents.
Wow. In my teaser and opening up today for the Crude Truth, I mentioned that we may be in a parallel with what was going on in the late 1970s. And, Mr. Frost, are you seeing some of those same parallels happening right now from the late 1970s to what's going on right now?
Well, over a period of time, of course, we became dependent on importing oil from Saudi Arabia and some other places. And this has been a major part of our economy, but we weren't able to produce as much as we needed here in the United States. And so there have been changes, and fortunately, changes to the good. This Harold Hamm that I mentioned, the man in the oil business in Oklahoma, pioneered the use of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling to produce oil from shale, which was people didn't think you could do economically, and he figured out how to do that. And so we were dependent on foreign imports as well as domestic production. And the organization, the Council for a Secure America, that I've been very actively involved in, was set up to promote more domestic exploration, so that we would not be so dependent on oil from some unfriendly countries. And we were successful. Over the last 10 years or so, we've become much more energy independent. It's now really North America independent because we do import some oil from Canada. But it was to protect our own domestic economy. And also it's become an issue of foreign policy in recent years because the Russians are using energy as a weapon against some of our friends in Western Europe that we've been able to rally to help Ukraine. And the Russians, particularly the natural gas, have made it, they've tried to scare those people or blackmail them into not supporting democracy along with the United States. And so it's been very important that we produce enough for our own use and that we also have the capacity to work with our friends when they need help. And that's very important. We're a great power, and I hope we will be a great power forever. But the Russians are pretty nasty, as we all know, and they've done everything they can to blackmail the countries of Western Europe not to be supportive of our efforts in Ukraine. And fortunately, they've been unsuccessful so far.
They have been unsuccessful. And, I'm pretty sure everybody out there, for those of y'all that do not know, for all my listeners and viewers out there, Harold Hamm is has he retired? Continental Resources, one of the largest, and I think he just took it back independent here recently, if I'm
I think
correct.
that's right. I think that's right.
And so yes, no, Harold Hamm is definitely one of the. He's right up there with the T. Boone Pickens, and as far as I'm concerned, the Rockefellers, and I mean the Spindletop boys
Not
themselves.
quite that high, but he's been very creative and a pioneer. I mean, he did things that people didn't think was possible, and that helped us increase our own domestic production. And again, this organization that I'm involved in tries to promote more domestic production and also tries to support our friends. There are some people from the Northeast in the Jewish community who also have joined with us on this Council for a Secure America, because they're concerned about Israel and concerned about Israel being in a very tough neighborhood and having to deal with the Saudis and having to deal with Iran. And so it's been an effort to increase our own domestic production and also to be in a position where we can help our allies when they need the help. I had the interesting thing that happened to me my first year in Congress. Actually, the first month I was in Congress was when the accords between Israel and Egypt were signed. And
Yes.
as a new congressman, I had a chance to meet with Prime Minister Begin right before he went to the White House to sign the final document. And he told us at the time that the final point that had to be resolved was that Israel needed to be able to have a guaranteed supply of oil and gas, and that they were concerned that if they had to go to war again, that they might not have the energy they needed because they weren't producing very much of their own. Now they're producing some. And that the final issue that ended the deal and made sure it worked was the United States agreed to make energy available, particularly oil, at world market prices to Israel if they ever got in a bind and needed to import some. So this has been a very interesting combination. It's good for our country, and it's also good for our foreign policy. We want to continue to be a player in the Middle East. We also, because of NATO, we've been a major player in Europe, and we hope that Ukraine will survive as a democratic country. And we've now been able to help our allies in Western Europe deal with what the Russians have been trying to do to force them out.
You know, let's stick on that because you are an expert in the geopolitics world of
Well, I've
everything.
been around the block. I wouldn't say that I'm an expert, but I've been exposed to a lot of it and been part of some of it.
Well, you know, with Israel, look, I believe firmly that we need to, you know, I'm a Christian. I believe in God. I believe that Jesus sent, or that God sent his son Jesus to earth to save us all from our sins, okay, in a nutshell. And so I say that because I do believe that Israel is part of God's, literally part of God's country, just like Texas is.
Yeah.
And so we need to back Israel. There's some strife going on right now. You know, Benjamin Netanyahu is now prime minister again,
Right.
and people have rushed out to the streets to protest because he has removed his defense secretary due to a bill that he was hoping to pass that basically says Congress that their statesmen, Congress, Senate can overturn something that their Supreme Court puts in place. What are your thoughts on all of this?
Well, first of all, it's not in our interest to always be trying to tell our friends how to run their own countries, but we certainly have a right to express our opinions. And this would, if Netanyahu were successful, this would make Israel less of a democracy, and that's the concern. They've been our friend and the only democracy in the Middle East. So we hope that this can be worked out. Apparently, he's backed off temporarily. They're going to negotiate this. There were two pieces to this. I mean, one, he wanted to change the way members of their Supreme Court were selected, giving the executive branch a lot more power to do that, and also the Knesset, the legislature, to be able to overrule decisions they didn't like, which was highly controversial in Israel. A lot of people took to the streets. These were peaceful protests, but they were massive protests. And so we hope they'll be able to work that out. But again, we don't tell our friends how to run their own government, but we do express our support for democracy. And this is a serious problem because they will be, a lot of people see that they will be much less democratic if they were to change their court system. So we hope that gets resolved. But we'll continue to work with them. We'll continue to support them. Israel has great support in the United States, both among Democrats and Republicans. It's always been a bipartisan issue. So it's an interesting combination of people who are supportive of Israel and also people who are supportive of making sure we have enough oil and gas produced in our country so that we can meet all our own needs and be able to help our friends. You know, there are some folks in the United States who want to stop producing oil and gas. I personally think that's crazy. You need to have it certainly as a bridge fuel, and for the foreseeable future. You can have all kinds of alternative energy. You can have wind, you can have solar, all kinds of things, but that doesn't happen overnight. And so you need to continue to produce enough oil and gas as we try to move more. We're not going to move exclusively to alternatives, but be able to move more to our alternative sources. But there are people who say they want to keep it in the ground. That's nuts. I mean, why would we keep this great natural resource of the United States in the ground and not develop it? So we want to see as much oil and gas produced as possible, and then we want to see us use it in an effective way so that we are able to promote democracy around the world and help our friends.
Yeah, and it's going to move up to the surface at some point. It may take 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years for it, but there will be puddles of oil on the ground at some point, because it does. That's why we got to now continuously drill deeper, because we've gotten the shallow and continue. But real quick on Israel, I love how they are. I saw last night that they have protesting, very peaceful protesting, and it says no civil war. You know, they're coming together as a country, and that is awesome. And I want to bring that back to America and talk about the oil and gas, because we are divided, unfortunately, as a nation when it comes to almost everything today, from masks from closures to how we get from point A to point B. I mean, shoot, even bicycles need petroleum products for the rubber on the tires. And so with you and your team at the Council for Secure America, how are you guys, feeling? What are the feelers out there from the Democratic Party of, hey guys, we need to have our own oil and gas being produced and refined here in America? How are you, what are you feeling from that side, Mr. Frost?
Well, Democrats, particularly from our part of the country, but all over, have been supportive of oil and gas production. This is it's not that the Republicans, of course, have been supportive also. There are some people in my party who are very strong environmentalists and who feel that this is a threat to the environment and continue to use oil and gas. And we've taken the position that, look, you can do both. It's not an either or proposition. We can develop all kinds of alternative sources. And when the legislation was passed that I mentioned a while ago about permitting the export of crude oil from the United States, we combined that with extending tax credits for wind and solar. And that gave it bipartisan support. You had the support of the Democratic leadership, you had the support of the Republican leadership. So there was a buy-in for Democrats to say, yes, we do want to have alternative sources. We want to explore all these other things. But in the meantime, we have to do everything we can to maximize our ability to produce oil and gas. So a lot of people in my party have historically been for the oil and gas industry. And there are some folks in my party who are environmentalists and who don't share those sentiments, but that's not the majority sentiment in the Democratic Party. We want our country to be as independent as we can to make sure that we maximize our own resources and energy. And there's a difference of opinion on how you do that, but so far we've been successful in being able to promote policies that maximize the production, the exploration and production of oil and gas. Just recently, the administration, the Democratic administration, announced that they were going to approve some development in Alaska, some major field development by one of the big major companies. And there had been opposition from environmentalists on that. Now they didn't say you could go everywhere in Alaska, but there was a particular field that is going to be developed, the Willow Field, and that will help us as a country, because we will be able to produce, estimates are 180,000 barrels a day from that field once the exploration occurs. And again, this is being done by a Democratic administration. Now, the Republicans have done a lot too. I'm not trying to criticize the Republicans. I'm just saying there are a lot of people on my side of the aisle who understand this issue and understand the importance of this issue for making us a powerful and independent country.
And if I may, I want to just point out to all my, that I did not lead with you on the show mentioning that you are a Democrat. And that's what you were in office from 1979 to 05 here in Fort Worth area. Okay. I wanted people to listen to, because again, I do feel that your knowledge on the U.S. energy policy and geopolitics, Martin Frost, are very important and very valid. And you do have a lot to say, so I did want to say that.
No, that's okay.
Everybody out there, that hey, I just wanted people to listen to what you had to say.
I appreciate that. But there are a lot of my Democratic colleagues, particularly from this part of the country, from the Southwest, who have historically been active supporters of the oil and gas industry and continue to be so.
Well, where is it? I'm going to ask you this question, and give me the crude truth answer if you can. What is it about the Northeast and California that these individuals seem to think, Senator Ted Cruz said it best, that they could just flip a switch and kill the oil and gas? Because like you said, we need a good bridge alternative fuel. And right now that looks like natural gas, but we can talk about all that. But what is it that they're thinking,
I think that one of the problems is the offshore accidents you've had. The fact that they're concerned about their beaches, they're concerned about their tourist business. They don't want their beaches fouled, and we have to do everything we can to make sure the drilling is safe. I mean, no one's suggesting anything to the contrary, but I think some of that is driven by a concern that you had some of these big oil spills. You had that big one out in California, went on for years, and you've had some other accidents around the country. So I think part of it is that, quite frankly. Also, some of the folks, are anti-nuclear, and there are countries that use nuclear. Of course, France has used nuclear power for some time, but that's not the big issue in the United States. The big issue in the United States now, as we look for bridge fuels for the future, is wind and solar. And there are a lot of Texas got a lot of wind. we can produce a lot of wind industry. It's not easy to do, and it is expensive. And solar is also we have a lot of sunshine here that some other parts of the country don't have. So let's do both. Let's do it all. But let's don't stick our head in the sand and say, you can convert tomorrow to alternative fuels. Let's develop everything we can. We're a rich, resourceful country, and we can do both. And at the meantime, let's make sure that we're doing everything we can to maximize oil and gas production. There's the administration. The Biden administration approved some new facilities to be able to export crude oil to be constructed down on the Gulf Coast, and they're doing their part. They're not going to go 100% and say just do oil and gas and don't do anything else, but they've tried to be helpful. And I talk to them from time to time. I've known a lot of the people in the administration, and let's as I said, let's be smart here. And particularly now natural gas, because there are production of natural gas in the Mediterranean, and Israel's a part of that. And being able to have some pipelines to send that gas over to Western Europe, because that's where the Russians are really trying to squeeze people, is to cut off their supply of natural gas during the winter. So this is a complicated question, but there are people on both sides of the aisle who understand this issue, and we try and rally them to make the case.
If you don't mind, real quick, you mentioned that the President Biden administration approved some things down on the Gulf Coast. What did they approve?
The construction of facilities to be able to massive facilities to be able to actually export crude oil.
That's right. Yes. Okay.
And they also have said they're going to permit the drilling to go forward in parts of Alaska. It's going to produce a lot of oil. So both sides understand this issue. The Republicans have some extreme folks on their side that, of course, I don't agree with, and we have some extreme folks on my side that I don't agree with. But there's enough room in the middle where you can get both Democrats and Republicans to stand up and say, yes, the energy industry is a very important part of our economy.
We'll see. That's right. He did approve that. We'll see if we get the permitting for it.
That's right. Well, that's a big issue.
Yeah.
is, and there's some legislation pending right now that the Republicans have offered to speed up the permitting process. And my organization, the Council for Secure America, again, we're nonpartisan. We're both Democrats and Republicans, but we have advocated speeding up permitting for major projects, and I hope that will happen.
Well, Martin, we're running a little short on time. I've got to ask you this, and give me your crude truth. Give me the crude truth. Have you ever seen a time in Congress where there were so many people far to the right and so many people far to the left?
The answer is no. And I was a reporter before I was a congressman. I covered Congress for a magazine, Congressional Quarterly, and then I went to law school at Georgetown. And because I decided I really wanted to pursue politics, and then came back to Texas where I'd grown up, clerked for a federal judge in Dallas, and wound up getting elected 8 years after I came back. But no, I've never seen anything like this. You have some nutty people on both sides of the aisle, and it's unfortunate for our country, but so far there are enough of us in the middle that we can get things done.
Yeah, that's true, and that's the crude truth. We gotta come together in the middle, and God willing, we can continue that to stay the superpower that we are. Well, Martin, for all my listeners and viewers out there that may want to send you any questions or invite you to be on their show, how can they get a hold of you?
Well, we have our organization, the Council for Secure America, does set up interviews, and the best thing is to contact them. They're the ones who arrange all of this. And I occasionally get down to Texas. I still am asked to give a speech once in a while, which I do. But I am retired, and retirement is nice. I'll say that much. Although I've done some interesting things. I was a speaker on cruise ships for 5 years about American politics. Got a free cruise for myself and my wife. And then COVID hit, and my wife said, "No more cruise ships." The industry didn't understand how to deal with it.
Yeah, I don't blame them.
And I taught for 5 years at the George Washington University Graduate School of Political Management. And so I've done some interesting things. But contact the Council for Secure America. We have a website, and we have some people who handle all the inquiries for speaking and for articles, and we try and do those as much as we can. There are a bunch of us who do it. I'm not the only one. I'm one of the directors. I'm secretary of the organization. But we have a fellow, Fred Zeidman from Houston, who's a Republican and who's one of the co-chairs of the organization. He and I work very closely on coordinating these type things.
Well, and I'll also put that in the show notes. You've been seen on C-SPAN. You've got your opinion that you've written in Newsweek magazine titled "Europe Proves a Rush to Green Energy Demands Too High." And again, everything that you guys are doing with the Council for Secure America is A-OK. And so I do thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thanks for the time.
No problem. Thank you. And thank you all of my viewers and listeners out there. And we'll see you next time on The Crude Truth.
This episode of The Crude Truth is brought to you by Oil and Gas Workers Association, Sandstone Group, Air Compressor Solutions, Basin Fluids and the Fuel Pros, and